Hello everyone, welcome back to my Form 5 Ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. Today we're going to take a look at question 6, Article 3, where Aquinas starts to go into not only voluntary action, but also inaction, and the way in which not doing things can also be voluntary. So let's get right to it with a quick overview. We're not going to spend nearly as much time on this article as we did on Article 1, in part because it's a little bit easier, and in part because, in theory, you're getting better at this. We'll see. So we just have two important objections to look at this time that we're going to focus on. We also have a very good and intuitive story that he tells in the Respondeo. We're going to spend a good bit of time interpreting that story and giving some various examples and expanding on it. There's also a famous sed contra, and we're going to end up using the language in the sed contra for a long time, but there's a little bit of a trick to it. So we'll spend just a little bit of time explaining that when we get there. The big issue here is when can inaction be voluntary? When can it be action? This is not just throwing around word games. We want to be able to praise or blame people for not doing things. When you don't do something, is that also your fault or to your credit? It doesn't always have to be a bad thing when you fail to do something. It could be a very good thing. And if we only talked about voluntary action in terms of things we positively do, we would have a pretty thin and strange ethics. We also need to look a little bit more technically at how negations work, both grammatically and logically. And that's going to be a skill that we employ repeatedly throughout the semester. So that's an important part of today's work. And then very important for the future, we have a distinction now, finally, between two parts or two components of the voluntary action, an interior element and an exterior element. And that will be useful not only in the next article, but for all of the rest of our time together in ethics. So I enjoy these objections quite a bit. I think they're all pretty funny. Like I said, we're going to only focus on two of them. Objection 3, we can just dispense with pretty quickly, I think. It's really a variation on objection 1. And it is interesting in that it goes back to the knowledge of the end stuff that we talked about in Article 1. And we will spend more time elaborating on the knowledge of the end side of things in the future. But it doesn't really do us any good here. So we're just gonna skip it. Objections 1 and 2, on the other hand, are very important, and you need to understand them very well. The first objection has the entirety of the Aristotelian doctrine of change buried in it. Basically the reduction of potency to act that I taught you all in third form, for those of you that were my students in those days. So we're going to go back and take another look at act and potency and how that applies to the will, which is another physics to ethics move, as I've talked about before. And then the second objection is where we look directly at the negations. And this is the objection that really steers the Respondeo and is a little bit of a fun word game. So we're going to take quick look at the text and explanation for those first two objections. Objection 1, it would seem that voluntariness cannot be without any act, for that is voluntary which proceeds from the will. But nothing can proceed from the will except through some act, at least an act of the will. Therefore, there cannot be voluntariness without act, which sounds a little bit like it's phrased strangely. It's a little bit of a runaround with the words, I think. But it is asking that first question that I posed at the beginning of this article. When can we talk about a voluntary action when there's nothing happening, when there's inaction, voluntary inaction? And the objector is claiming that there's no such thing. And it's for a very simple reason, and it has to do with act and potency. Every action, when we talk about doing things, it's a kind of change, and we can analyze it in terms of potency and act. Every action is the reduction of potency to act, and we could draw this, with some sort of silly set of symbols to simplify it and look like fancy modern philosophers as P arrow A, where we could state it either as A is the action is being reduced from potency, or you could say that action proceeds from potency, or act proceeds from potency. So that's the general form for all change, for all action, and the will is a potency. This is clearly discussed earlier in the Summa. It's not something we've looked at, but it is a power. And so we can just swap in will where we see P. We'll abbreviate it V for voluntas. And if the will is a potency, then and something is happening with it, then it's action that proceeds from the voluntas. And that means that when there's voluntariness, the will is doing something. And if the will is doing something, that's action. That's just the definition of action. So when something proceeds from the will, there's action. And therefore, if there isn't anything happening, then there is no voluntariness. Voluntariness and action go together. That's the point of the objection. Objection 2, text. Further, just as one is said to wish by an act of the will, so when the act of the will ceases, one is said not to wish. But not to wish implies involuntariness, which is contrary to voluntariness. Therefore, there can be nothing voluntary when the act of the will ceases. This is where we're playing the game with the negations. We start with a positive statement and then we throw the negative on. One of my favorite games every year is to have my students try to explain this to me in class, and I'm going to do my best not to ruin that fun for me this year. So I'm going to have this be one of our main exercises when we're together in our live class. What's going on here is a pretty simple grammatical distinction in the reply. You should be able to read this and get the sense of it, maybe not in the objection, but at least in the way Aquinas answers it. Although, admittedly, the terminology is a little bit of a runaround. We're beginning with the basic idea of when you want something, that's voluntariness. And if you negate the wanting, then you negate the voluntariness. So when you don't want something, it's involuntary. There's a mistake being made here, and I'm not going to say what it is right now. There's some kind of equivocation going on, and in the response that he gives, you should be able to see what that is. It's very important in part because of what happens in the Respondeo. It's one of the main drivers of how he answers. But it's also very important for how we will talk about involuntariness and non-voluntariness as opposed to voluntariness in the future. You can't get a simple negation of voluntariness. There's more than one way to negate it. It's probably a better way to say it. So those are the two objections that we care about. The third, here's the text of it. Knowledge is essential to the voluntary, as stated above in Article 1, but knowledge involves act. Therefore, voluntariness cannot be without act. You should be able to see that that's basically the same thing as Objection 1, except instead of talking about V for voluntas, now we're talking about I for intellectum. And since Aquinas doesn't really do anything with it in the replies, we're not going to do anything with it either. We will come back and focus on the intellect later. Now, I said the sed contra was a little bit strange. Here it is, very famous. The word voluntary is applied to that of which we are masters. Now, we are masters in respect of to act and not to act, to will and not to will. Therefore, just as to act and to will are voluntary, so also are not to act and not to will. It's a little unclear, I think, just as a standalone, whether we should take this as a starting point for what's coming next in the Respondeo, or as what the Respondeo is actually about to establish. Is this an intuitive appeal, or is it a generic citation where we could have thrown any author in there? St. Augustine certainly says something very much like this, and not alone. It's not made very obvious how this one works. And I don't think we should waste too much time getting bogged down in these kinds of questions about the sed contra, although they are interesting, and we can certainly talk about them in class. The thing to focus on as a student, I think, is the terminology here, master. It is dominus in Latin, so Lord, if you've taken your basic Latin, like all my students have, so where we get domination and dominance and things like that. How should we think about mastery when we're talking about being masters of acting and not acting, willing and not willing? What does it mean that we are masters? Possibly we should try to think about this in terms of control. Voluntary is applied to that we have control over. That might not be quite the right way to go, but I think it's at least a start for that you would understand as students for the most part. Maybe it should be thought of instead in terms of responsibility, or maybe both. A way in which we have responsibility for these things, a way in which we have control over things, the reach, ethically speaking, the way in which we can affect or even be causes in the world around us. That might be another way to think about it. So there's definitely some work to do here, and we will come back to this. But at the end, I think this is an easier sed contra to handle when all is said and done, as opposed to a way to get us launched into the Respondeo. Turning to the Respondeo, It starts off tough and then I think gets easy. He begins with a very quick distinction. The voluntary is what proceeds from the will, or the voluntary is what proceeds from the voluntas. Now, one thing proceeds from another in two ways, and then he gives you his first and his second. It might be worth mentioning here that this verb in English, proceeds, is not there in the Latin. The Latin is using a different construction. So, and I think the translators are just trying to put it in terms that we would be more natural to use in our language, because we don't really use this Latin construction. In Latin, it says that the voluntarium is a voluntate, that something is of another. It's an ablative of origin, basically. Even that may be a little unclear, a little bit unclear to us anyway. And so we're using this proceed or procession language. Possibly using the language of procession is confusing things a little bit. But the root idea seems to be that one thing has its origin in another, or from another, in one of two ways. The response is a little tricky, I think, because indirect procession involves a negation. It's an inaction, which is, of course, the thing we care about. But it's not always easy to think about what inactions are. The logic of negations is a little harder. In his first branch, when we have direct procession, this is what you would all, I think, intuitively go to as your example of one thing arising from another or being caused by another. It's probably harder to come up with examples of indirect procession until you get the idea of it. Direct procession is the sense in which something proceeds from another inasmuch as this other acts. For instance, heating from heat. Doesn't say a lot there, and maybe a few more examples would help, but I think the basic idea is you have some sort of direct causation, right? You could probably put being pushed directly proceeds from pushing. Yeah, I think that's still fair in terms of what he's going for here. That's just what heat does. Things are heated by it. A heat source heating another thing. It would be nice if we could have a longer treatment here, but that would, of course, involve going back and looking at his commentary on the physics, which we're not going to do. I'll give you a link for it if you really want to. If you want to go look at Aristotle's physics, we can go do that for fun. I also think this Respondeo was a little tricky because when he goes to indirect procession, or something arising from another or coming from another indirectly, the example he gives involves a rational agent. And as I'm asking over here on the right, are there physics examples of indirect procession, as we're saying it in the English? Could we have chosen something other than a human to illustrate indirect procession? This, again, if you're interested in the technical side of that question, we need to go look at the physics. But just working with what we have in front of us, we might try to propose some physics examples, and maybe you could think of better ones. We can say that the wilting of the flowers proceeds indirectly from the rain because the rain didn't fall, perhaps, or the kite fell because the wind didn't blow. Right? In any case, we're talking about something happening because something else didn't act. Something proceeds from another through the other not acting. The wind didn't do something, and therefore. The rain didn't do something, and therefore. Maybe there's not a good physics example. Maybe we should just go straight to the rational. At any rate, things become, I think, a lot easier when he gives his example, because this is the story of the ship. The sinking of the ship is set down to the helmsman from his having ceased to steer. And this is the intuitive story that I mentioned at the beginning. I've restarted the story a little bit here. The sinking of a ship is set down to the helmsman, the guy at the wheel, the guy at the rudder, from his having ceased to steer. But we must take note that the cause of what follows from want of action is not always the agent as not acting, but only when the agent can and ought to act. For if the helmsman were unable to steer the ship, or if the ship's helm be not entrusted to him, the sinking of the ship would not be set down to him, although it might be due to his absence from the helm. Because I'm sure one of my students or a small handful will be confused. I can imagine tripping a little bit over want of action, since we're using the word want a lot to describe the will, and here it means obviously lack or absence, the lack of action, but through inaction. So we've got a story where a helmsman is supposed to be steering the ship, and he doesn't, and the ship hits the rocks and the ship sinks. What we need to do is think through that story, is retell that story in a variety of ways to show all of the possibilities that Aquinas maps out in what comes next in the Respondeo, in the next couple of paragraphs or the next couple of sentences. And in, I guess, reply to objection 2. Because there's many ways to tell the story. And it might be helpful if you thought about it as a comedy routine. A lot of humor, you'd have a sketch comedy based around the idea that the captain is yelling at the helmsman when he shouldn't be, or the helmsman is giving ridiculous excuses that don't actually make sense. He's because they're trading on ambiguities in the way the helmsman could cease to steer. It's the helmsman's job to steer the ship, and so if he's at the rudder and they hit the rocks and he didn't steer around it, the captain can come out to yell at him, and the helmsman can say, "Well, you can't yell at me. I didn't do anything." And the captain is, of course, the reason it would be funny, if it would be funny, is that his inaction is the very issue. That his inaction is what caused the wreckage in the first place. But you could change the story in a case where the helmsman can't steer the ship and it's not his fault. Or he's asleep and someone else is on watch. So he's the helmsman, but only nominally. He's not really the helmsman whose inaction causes the ship to sink. So I'll expect my students to be able to come up with or to map out the variations. It might actually even be 5, depending on how you want to do it. Variations on the story without making them totally ridiculous, which is, of course, a hazard when you ask kids to come up with examples. But it can involve ninjas incapacitating pirates. That's fine. Now, this is how the Respondeo ends. And it's actually a really significant claim. Here's Aquinas on the left. Since then, the will, by willing and acting, is able, and sometimes ought, to hinder not willing and not acting, this not willing and not acting is imputed to as though proceeding from the will. It's always a lot of fun to read that in class, because a lot of my students like to put on the impression that they don't understand what it means. There are a lot of, it is a strange construction. But the basic claim here is really important. We can not want to do something, and we can will to do it anyway. So I don't want to do that, and then do it. And likewise, we can want to do something and yet restrain ourselves. So, and in both cases, it's an act of the will. The will can restrain itself. Right? The will can will something, and then we can say, no, we're not going to will that. We can stop. And that applies not only to the will's own act, but also to all of the things that we might do about it, the execution of that. Hence the willing and acting, not willing and not acting. He's very obviously not using a magic ethics term that we would all use now. It's every modern American's favorite ethics word. It might even be a modern American's only ethics word. So you can tell me in class or down in the comments, I guess, what that is. I guess if I'm a proper YouTube teacher, I should ask you to put it in the comments. But it's very clear that we're dancing around a word that you would all like to use to describe this. At any rate, we're not going to. We're going to follow Aquinas. And thus it is that we can have the voluntary without act, and now we get to the second objection material. Sometimes without outward act, but with an interior act. For instance, when one wills not to act, and sometimes without even an interior act, as when one does not will to act. And now we need to get really clear on what's going on with all those negations. And in part, it's relying on this line here in the story just before. The cause of what follows from want of action is not always the agent not acting, but only when the agent can and ought. That can and ought is going to play some role here in the inaction at the end. Now we have our distinction between interior and exterior act. That's going to be a really big deal for the future. And now we're going to be able to mess around a little bit with the negations from the second objection. We're going to diagram things. We're going to diagram twice, actually. So let's make a Porphyrian tree of that last sentence that we just looked at. Here, the tree on the right is just trying to stick as closely to what Aquinas says as possible. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a different one. And unfortunately, the The Porphyrian tree, just organizationally, is the reverse of how I would normally create it. Normally, I would have the affirmations running down the left and the negations running down the right, because normally we're looking at more and more clarifications or specifications on the affirmation, not the negation. But in this case, we're actually following the negative side. We want to look more closely at when we're missing things. And so the negations are running down the left. It also formats a little bit more nicely this way. I don't want to have the stuff we're talking about all the way on the outside of the slide, but we do what we can. Sorry. So we're talking about voluntariness, or voluntary action, or the voluntary, maybe, broadly, as Aquinas says it. And that can either be with an outward act or without an outward act. Now, if there's an outward act, then we're just talking about the basics that we used as our examples in question 6, article 1. We're not looking at that in this article. That part's too easy. What we care about is when we don't have an outward act. When people are not doing things, that's still voluntary. But that's still not enough of a look. That's still not careful enough an analysis of what's happening. Because when you are lacking an outward act, you can still ask, is there an interior act? And that's what the second row is for, the second level, or the second distinction. You can have a lack of outward act where there is an interior act of the will. The will is willing something. You're willing not to do something. You've set your mind to it. You're consciously, as you might say, not willing something. You would probably fall back on words like choice here. You have freely chosen not to do something, or you've refused to do something. Might be a better way to say it. But you can also still have a voluntary act where there's no outward act and there's no interior act, because there could have been and should have been. When you fail to will to act, when your will doesn't do anything. And this is the way you answer the first objection. The first objection is just not getting deep enough. It's only relying on that first level of outward and no outward act, and it doesn't look closely enough at the second. It doesn't look at the second level at all. You can almost, once you finish the Respondeo, you can almost just dismiss the first objection. Aquinas very nearly does that, although he does actually give it a quick line. Now, we can also make this diagram another way, and making it another way is possibly a little bit clearer, possibly. Or at least maybe the second way will help you if the first way does not. I think when we're trying to tell the stories in the Respondeo of the ship sinking, this diagram might be a little easier. So we're still mapping the same Respondeo and the same idea, but now we are trying to look closely at inaction. Inaction can be voluntary or not. So voluntary inaction would be something like you've been knocked unconscious. You're asleep. You didn't do anything. Well, right. It wasn't because of an act of the will. Well, in what cases could we say that inaction is voluntary? Now we have our second distinction. It's either because there's an interior act of the will, you're willing inaction directly, you might say, or there's not an interior act of the will, but there should be. Now I didn't put the "but there should be" in the tree there because it messes up the formatting. Makes it a little bit harder to fit it all in. But you can write it in your notes. There is no interior act of the will. You didn't will anything, right, and you should have willed something. That second one, the negation, the bottom negation, that's something like negligence. Whereas, at least in the case of an evil action, the one on the left, where there's an interior act of the will, we would call it malice. When you don't do something, you could maliciously not do something, or you could negligently not do something. You could really choose it or will it. You could set your mind to it, or you could simply fail to do what you should have done. You can fail to will what you should have willed. And all of those are voluntary. And that's the Respondeo. We'll play around with the example of the ship to try to illustrate things a little bit more in class on Monday. And like I said, we're not going to look at the reply to objection 1, because essentially the Respondeo does it. The objection 1 is only looking at direct procession instead of indirect procession. And once you go through that Respondeo, it's clear that the objector is not looking closely enough at what's going on. But reply to objection 2, I want to put the text on the screen and read it to you, because this is your main homework assignment, I think, to explain this to me in class. Not to wish is said in two senses. First, as though it were one word, and the infinitive of I do not wish. Consequently, just as when I say I do not wish to read, the sense is I wish not to read. So, not to wish to read is the same as to wish not to read, and in this sense, not to wish implies involuntariness. Secondly, it is taken as a sentence, and then no act of the will is affirmed. And in this sense, not to wish does not imply involuntariness. This maps directly onto what we just said at the end of the at the end of the Respondeo there. So if you're stuck with this language, you can also flip back to that one. That might help you a little bit. Your project is to explain this to me, but this is the last time I'm ever going to use the word wish to express an act of the will. I find this to be a very curious translation choice. It's pretty traditional, at least as I know it, to use the English word wish to describe a very particular kind of act of the will that we'll talk about later, actually, in a month or two. I don't like to use it as the generic term for the act of the will. So I will always use want or will as the act words, even if that makes things confusing. Like if I want to say it in the future tense, I will. And I think that will avoid some problems for us down the road. At any rate, this is your task, and I wish you luck with it. If you have any questions about the reading or this video, you can hit me in the comments down below, or send the class Discord server, or send me an email. There's lots of ways to get a hold of me, and you know how to do it. In the meantime, study well, God bless, see you soon.